The day I signed the papers, my hands were shaking. Not from nerves, I was past the age of nervous hands, but from something closer to disbelief. 63 years on this earth, 31 of them building something from nothing, and now a number with 8 digits was sitting next to my signature on a contract that would change everything. $12.5 million. For a logistics company, I started in the back bedroom of a rented house with a second-hand laptop and a calling card. I remember sitting in the attorney's conference room after everyone had left, just staring at the stack of papers in front of me. The city outside the window looked the same as it always had. The same gray November sky, the same coffee cart on the corner, the same pigeons lined up on the ledge like they had nowhere better to be. But I had just sold the company I'd spent my adult life building, and somehow the world hadn't noticed. My very first thought was my husband. 26 years of marriage, 26 years of him watching me drive out before sunrise and come home after dark. 26 years of him saying, "You work too hard," while I ate dinner standing at the kitchen counter because I didn't have the energy to sit down. He had been there at the beginning, when the company was just a name I'd chosen on a Tuesday afternoon because it sounded professional. He had been there through the slow years, the years when I wasn't sure we'd make payroll, the years when I second-guessed everything. I wanted him to be there for this moment too. I called him from the lobby. It went to voicemail. I called again. Voicemail. I thought nothing of it. He was a hospital administrator. His days were controlled chaos board meetings, staff shortages, budget reviews. I knew the rhythm of his work life better than he did. So I decided to drive to his office instead of going home. I would walk in there and say the words out loud to his face. $12.5 million. I wanted to watch his expression when I said it. I stopped and bought a bottle of champagne on the way. The woman at the wine shop helped me pick it out. She asked what we were celebrating, and I told her I'd just sold my company, and she looked at me the way people do when they're genuinely happy for a stranger. She wrapped it in tissue paper and put it in a bag with handles like it was a gift. The hospital administration building was a separate structure from the main complex, a squat brick building with a parking lot that was always half full. I knew the layout by heart. I had attended enough holiday parties there, enough retirement dinners in the conference room where someone always gave a speech that ran too long. I signed in at the front desk. The security guard, a young man named Terrell, recognized me and waved me through with a smile, and I took the elevator to the 3rd floor. His office was at the end of the hall. The door was closed, which wasn't unusual. He often closed the door for calls. I could hear voices inside his, and a woman's, and I remember thinking it was probably his assistant, Patricia, going over his schedule. I knocked once out of courtesy, and when there was no answer, I turned the handle. I don't think either of them heard the door open. She was sitting on the edge of his desk, not in a chair, on the actual surface of his desk, and he was standing close enough to her that their shoulders were touching. She was young. Not young the way you say it when someone is in their 30s. Young the way you mean it when you realize the gap is genuinely unsettling. She was laughing at something he'd said, and his hand was on her back. The champagne bag crinkled when I tightened my grip on it. He turned around. I have tried, in the years since, to accurately describe the expression on his face in that moment. It wasn't guilt. Exactly, guilt has a quality of softness to it, a kind of pleading. What I saw was something more calculated. His face went through 3 or 4 different arrangements in the space of about 2 seconds, like he was sorting through options. Then he settled on what I can only describe as a kind of controlled concern. The face of a man who knew he was caught but had decided, in real time, that he could still manage the situation. "Linda," he said. "Just my name. Nothing else." The young woman slid off the desk and looked at me with the specific expression of someone who has never once imagined being the other person in that room. She smoothed her skirt. She didn't say anything. She walked past me and out the door, and I stepped aside to let her pass because 30 years of good manners are apparently impossible to override even in a crisis. I set the champagne down on his desk, in the bag, still wrapped in tissue paper. "How long?" I asked. He said he didn't know what I was talking about. I asked again, very quietly, and something in my stillness must have reached him, because he stopped performing and sat down in his chair and looked at the floor. "About 2 years," he said. 2 years. I did the math automatically, the way your brain does when it's trying to protect you by staying busy. 2 years ago, I had been in the middle of a merger negotiation that had nearly collapsed. 2 years ago, my mother had been in the hospital for 3 weeks with pneumonia, and I had driven 4 hours each way on weekends to sit with her. 2 years ago, our youngest grandchild had been born, and I had held her in the hospital waiting room while my husband stood next to me with his arm around my shoulder. He had been sleeping with someone else the entire time he held that baby. I picked up the champagne bag and walked out. I sat in my car for a long time. I didn't cry. I want to be honest about that because I think people expect a woman in that situation to cry, and I didn't. I felt something cold move through me, starting in my chest and spreading outward, and I understood that the cold was clarity. Everything was becoming very, very clear. I drove home. I made myself a cup of tea. I sat at the kitchen table and I thought about what I knew and what I didn't know and what I needed to find out before I did anything else. Here is the thing no one tells you about discovering that your marriage is not what you believed it to be. The shock is not the hardest part. The shock is almost easy because shock has a kind of numbness built into it. The hard part comes later, when you start excavating, when you start looking back at everything and asking yourself what was real. Our anniversary trip to Portugal 2 summers ago, real or performance? The Sunday mornings when he brought me coffee in bed while I read Habit or Guilt? The way he had held my hand at my mother's funeral 8 months ago, steady and warm, the whole service, was any part of that actually for me? I didn't sleep that night. He came home at 11. I was still sitting at the kitchen table. He stood in the doorway, and I told him I needed him to go sleep in the guest room. He started to say something, and I held up one hand and he stopped. He knew me well enough to know when I was finished. Over the next week, we had a series of conversations that I can only describe as surgical. I asked questions. He answered them. I did not yell. I did not throw things. I did not cry in front of him. I have always believed that you show people exactly as much of your interior as you choose to, and I chose not to show him any of it. Her name was Kristen. She worked in hospital fundraising, which was how they had met. She was 34. When he told me her age, I watched his face carefully, and I saw something there, not shame, but a kind of pride that he was trying to suppress. That told me everything I needed to know about the shape of what had happened. On the 4th day, he asked me about the sale. He had clearly been waiting. I could see him deciding when to bring it up, watching for the right moment. He asked how the closing had gone, and whether the final number had come through as expected, and his voice had a careful quality to it that I recognized from his board meetings, the tone of a man who has prepared what he's going to say. I told him the number. He didn't say congratulations. The first thing he said, after a pause that lasted just a beat too long, was, "That's marital assets, you know. We'd need to talk to a financial advisor about how to structure the—" I stood up and walked out of the room. I want to tell you something about that moment, because I know what some people think. I know some people hear this story, and their first question is, why did you tell him at all? And it's a fair question. I've asked it myself. Here is the honest answer. I told him because I had spent 26 years treating this man as my partner. Because that impulse to share the best thing with the person you've built your life with doesn't switch off cleanly just because you've opened a door and seen something you can't unsee. I had 30 years of habit in my body, and it took me those 4 days to fully understand that the person those habits were built around no longer existed, or perhaps had never existed the way I believed he had. But I also want to tell you something else. It didn't matter, because the one thing I had done right, the one decision I had made at 31 years old that would protect me 32 years later, was start that company before I ever met him. I called my attorney the morning after he asked about the money. Her name is Carol, and she has been practicing family law in this state for 25 years, and when I explained the situation, she was quiet for a moment and then said, "Tell me when you founded the company." I told her. She asked me to send her the original incorporation documents, my earliest tax filings, and the bank records from the first 2 years. She called me back 3 hours later. "Linda," she said, "this is clean. The company was your separate property. You can document the founding predates the marriage by 4 years. As long as you didn't formally bring him on as a partner or co-owner at any point, and as long as he didn't make documented financial contributions that he can argue entitled him to equity, you are protected." He had never been on the paperwork. I had offered early in our marriage to add him as a co-owner, and he had declined because he said it was my thing and he didn't want to complicate it. I had thought that was generous of him. I understood now it was indifference dressed up as support. I filed for divorce 22 days after I walked into his office. He hired a lawyer the same week. His lawyer sent a letter arguing that the value of the company had grown significantly during the marriage and that the marital contribution, my time, my labor, which he argued had been subsidized by his income, entitled him to a portion of the proceeds. It was a creative argument. Carol told me it was also a weak one, and that she had seen it before, and that we would be fine. What followed was 6 months that I will not pretend were easy. There were depositions, there were financial disclosures. There were days when I sat across a conference table from him and his attorney, and I looked at the man I had shared a home with for more than 2 decades, and I felt nothing that I could reliably name. Not anger. By then, not grief exactly. Something quieter and more permanent. The recognition that I had been loving a version of someone that I had partly invented. His attorney pushed hard on the idea that my success had been built on the foundation of his income. Carol dismantled this argument methodically, documentation by documentation, year by year. My company had turned profitable in its 3rd year before our 5th year of marriage. After that point, my income had exceeded his every single year. The tax returns were unambiguous. He did not get a share of the sale. What he received was the settlement we negotiated, which included his portion of the equity in our home and a sum that Carol advised me was reasonable given the length of the marriage. I will not tell you the number because it doesn't matter. What matters is that it was fair, and that fair was different from what he had wanted, and that watching him understand the difference was the only moment in the entire process when I allowed myself to feel something close to satisfaction. Kristen, I should tell you, did not stay. By the time the divorce was finalized, they had ended things. I heard this through our daughter, who heard it through her father, who seemed to think this information might prompt some response from me. It didn't. What they had or didn't have was never the point. The point was the marriage I thought I had and didn't. Our daughter, she was in her late 30s by then, smart and clear-eyed and furious in a way that I sometimes had to gently redirect, asked me once if I was angry. We were having dinner at her house, just the 2 of us. A few months after the divorce was final. She asked it carefully, like she wasn't sure she wanted the answer. I thought about it for a real moment before I responded. I told her, yes, I had been angry. Early on, in those first weeks, I had been angry in a way that lived in my body, a kind of tension in my jaw and my shoulders that never fully released. But I had made a decision somewhere in those 6 months of legal proceedings to put my energy somewhere that would compound rather than corrode. Anger that sits inside you doesn't punish anyone but yourself. I had seen too many women my age spend years in the corrosive bath of a betrayal they wouldn't release, and I had decided I would not be one of them. She reached across the table and squeezed my hand and didn't say anything. She didn't need to. I took a trip that spring. I had always wanted to go to the Amalfi Coast. It was one of those things I'd said for years and never done, always another quarter to close, always another problem to solve. I booked a hotel on a cliff above the sea, and I went alone, which felt strange for approximately the first 24 hours, and then felt like exactly the right decision for every hour after that. I walked along the water in the early mornings. I ate dinner at small restaurants where I didn't speak the language, and the waiters were patient with my pointing. I sat on my balcony in the evenings and watched the light change over the water, and I thought about what the next chapter was going to look like. And for the first time in a very long time, I felt something that I can only describe as spaciousness. Like a room with all the furniture removed, empty in a way that felt like possibility rather than loss. I met a man at the hotel. I want to be careful about how I say this, because it is not the point of this story, and I have never been a person who believed that the resolution to a marriage ending is simply finding someone new. But I met him, and he was kind, and he was funny in the particular dry way that I have always responded to, and he was 67 years old and had navigated his own version of loss. And we had dinner together 4 nights in a row and talked in the way you can sometimes talk with strangers honestly, without the accumulated weight of history and expectation. We have been talking regularly since. Where that goes, I genuinely don't know. But I notice I am curious about it, and I have learned to treat my own curiosity as information. Here is what I know now. At 64, that I did not know at 31 when I started a company in a back bedroom with a second-hand laptop. The things you build belong to you. Not in the legal sense, though, in my case, fortunately, in the legal sense too, but in a deeper sense that I am still learning to articulate. The company was mine, not because of a contract or an incorporation date, but because I was the one who showed up for it. Every early morning, every difficult quarter, every year when I wasn't sure it would survive and I stayed anyway. That kind of investment doesn't transfer. It doesn't divide. It is yours in a way that no one can take. What I also know is this. The morning I walked out of that closing, before I drove to that office, before I opened that door, I was already the person I needed to be. Everything that came after the discovery, the divorce, the legal battle, the trip, the balcony above the sea, all of it was just me finally living at the size I had already grown into. I am telling you this because I know some of you watching have done the same quiet, relentless kind of building that I did. You have shown up every day for something, a business, a career, a family, a dream you never quite abandoned, and you have wondered if it was worth it, and whether anyone noticed, and whether the life you were building was the life you actually wanted. I want you to know, it is yours. All of it. Whatever you have built with your own hands, and your own hours, and your own stubborn refusal to quit, it belongs to you in the realest way that anything can. No one can walk into that closing with you, but no one can take it from you either. That is what I know now.